There was a sound that carried across American water and over the hills, a rising mechanical scream you could hear a quarter-mile off before you saw the truck that made it. Men who drove behind it knew it by name. They called it the Screaming Jimmy. For nearly 50 years it ran, and better than 1 in 3 of the heavy trucks on the interstate drove the tanks across France and landed American infantry at Normandy. Then, by the early 1990s, every on-highway version had been pulled from production, and inside a decade the sound was gone. The company that built it did not go bankrupt. It was not beaten by a foreign rival. This is the story of a single decision that buried an empire its own engineers spent 50 years building. So how does a company walk away from the engine that gave it 40% of the market? Hold that question. Because the answer is not a single dramatic collapse. It is one decision, refused once and then refused again, until the refusing was the company. Go back to 1930. American heavy transport runs on gasoline. Trucks, buses, construction plant, the working machinery of an industrializing continent, all of it burns gasoline. Diesel engines exist, but they are a European technology built around the four-stroke cycle that Rudolf Diesel patented in the 1890s. Those engines are heavy, they are finicky. A four-stroke diesel of that era needs a precision injection pump, an exotic valve train, and a mechanic who can rebuild a fuel system as if it were a watch. None of that fits a freight yard in Cleveland or a railway shed in Kansas City. One man at General Motors believed the entire architecture was wrong. Charles Kettering ran research for the corporation. He was a self-taught farm boy from Ohio, the man who invented the electric self-starter and killed the hand crank, the device that had hospitalized more early drivers than the cars themselves. By 1930, he was in his mid-50s, with the kind of standing inside the company that comes from being right about machines nobody else believed in. The leaded gasoline, the refrigerant that made home cooling possible. The diesel locomotive engine that would one day push steam off the American railroads. He had the ear of the board and a reputation for backing the engineers against the accountants. What he did not have was unlimited credit. Every argument Kettering won, the engineering committee remembered, and the committee ran the budget reviews. His idea for diesel was a different machine entirely, a two-stroke. A power stroke on every single revolution of the crankshaft, instead of every other one. More power for the same displacement. A simpler valve train. Modular, scalable from 2 cylinders to 16 using identical pistons, identical liners, identical injectors throughout the whole family. Strippable in the field with hand tools. It was, on paper, exactly what working America needed. There was one problem. Every previous two-stroke diesel ever built had failed. They smoked, they fouled, they self-destructed inside 1,000 hours. The trouble was scavenging. In a two-stroke, the burnt exhaust has to leave the cylinder in the same fraction of a second that fresh air comes in. Get the geometry even slightly wrong, and the two streams mix. The cylinder fills with hot exhaust diluted by cold air. Combustion goes ragged. Black smoke pours from the stack and power collapses under load. Kettering's team tried one-port geometry. It failed. They tried a second. It failed. This was the bottom of the Great Depression. Every other division of the corporation was cutting headcount, and here was a small research team burning real money on a dynamometer to confirm what the committee already suspected. They reviewed the program. They recommended termination. And this is the moment the whole story turns on. Kettering refused the recommendation. He asked for one more configuration. The answer arrived in the second half of the 1930s. They called it uniflow scavenging. Fresh air enters through ports cut around the bottom of the cylinder liner. Exhaust leaves through valves at the top of the head. Air and exhaust move in one direction only, bottom to top, and they never mix. A Roots-type supercharger, geared straight off the crankshaft, forces the air through under pressure. For the first time, the engine breathed cleanly. Clean exhaust at full load. A stable idle. A power curve the European four-strokes could not touch for the displacement. The same committee that had voted to kill the program signed off on the production budget. General Motors established the Detroit Diesel Engine Division, and in 1938 the first product rolled out, the Series 71. 71 cubic inches of displacement per cylinder, offered in 2, 3, 4, and 6-cylinder versions, all of them sharing the same bore, the same stroke, the same heads, the same liners, the same pistons. A mechanic who could service one could service all of them. A parts depot that stocked for one, stocked for all of them. It was the closest thing American heavy industry had yet seen to a truly modular diesel. Between 1938 and 1941, the engine took hold. Buses, trucks, marine craft. Fleet operators sent back fuel and reliability numbers the gasoline competition could not match. A 6-cylinder 71 in a city bus might run 800 hours between maintenance intervals, where a gasoline engine ran 200. Bus mechanics in Chicago noticed the diesels did not lose compression the way the sparked ignition units did. Long-haul operators in Texas and California wrote to Detroit asking how soon they could place orders. Then, in December of 1941, a telegram changed the entire calculation. The Series 71 was not going to be proven on a test stand in Detroit. It was going to be proven on a beach, under fire, at a production rate the factory had never attempted. The War Production Board cataloged every diesel engine in American industry. The list was short. The Series 71 was the only American diesel that could be built at scale, serviced in the field with basic tools, and deployed across every kind of vehicle at once. Detroit Diesel got the contract, 3 shifts. The line never stopped. By 1943, the plant employed 4,300 people, more than 1,400 of them women, and together they built nearly 58,000 engines in that single year. Walk through that building on second shift in the spring of 1943. It does not feel like a factory, it feels like a foundry told to run faster than it was ever designed to run. The smell hits you first. Hot iron off the casting floor. The chemical sting of cutting oil from the boring lines. The burnt sugar tang of 2-stroke exhaust from test cells running engines around the clock. Conveyor belts carry cylinder blocks past inspection stations, where women in coveralls gauge bore tolerances to the nearest thousandth of an inch. The men are overseas. The noise is stamping presses and the howl of horizontal mills and the rising scream of a 671 being run up on the stand for its acceptance cycle before it is crated and shipped. Every engine leaving that plant was going somewhere a soldier or a sailor needed it to work. The marinized Gray Marine 671 powered the Higgins boat, the flat-bottomed plywood landing craft that put American infantry onto the beaches from Normandy to Tarawa. The M4A2 Sherman tank ran on the GM 6046, which was 2 inline 671 engines bolted together on a common crankcase, sharing one output shaft. The military trusted Kettering's modular architecture enough to double it rather than commission something new. And the sound was born in those years. That supercharger whine at high revolutions carrying across water and over hills and through coastal fog. The men who worked around it gave it the name. Some said it came from GMC, General Motors, shortened to Jimmy. Some said it came from the sound itself. Both were true. The name stuck, and it would follow the engine for the next 50 years. When the war ended in 1945, surplus engines flooded the civilian market. Greyhound built its post-war intercity network on Detroit diesel power. Mack specified the 12-cylinder version for heavy haulage. Tugboats on the Mississippi, fishing fleets out of New Bedford, offshore rigs in the Gulf, generators in mines and at remote pipeline stations. The Screaming Jimmy became the sound of post-war American commercial life. The engine itself became a kind of character on the road. The 671 was not the smoothest engine in the country, and it was not the quietest. The supercharger drone at idle was loud enough to set a coffee cup vibrating on a diner counter 40 feet away. What it offered in exchange for the noise was the closest thing American freight had ever known to a guaranteed working day. A 671 would start in a Wyoming winter at 30 below. It would run on diesel cut with almost anything that poured. It would take maintenance from a man with a tool roll and a service manual in a yard in the rain. Drivers learned its language. They knew when a bearing was on the way out by the sound alone. They knew which injector was fouling by the change in the exhaust note over a particular gear change. The engine talked to them, and they listened. There is a phrase this audience knows in its bones. They don't make them like they used to. The 671 was the proof of it. A man could buy one, run it hard for 1,000,000 miles, rebuild it on a shop floor with parts he could hold in his hand, and run it another million. It was built to be repaired, not replaced. The men who poured the iron and bored the cylinders and ran the test stands knew exactly what they were sending out the door. And they took a particular kind of pride in it that does not transfer to a spreadsheet. That pride was a real asset on the company's books, even though it never appeared on one. By the middle of the 1950s, on a typical American interstate, better than 1 in 3 of the heavy trucks rolling past you was running a Detroit diesel. At its peak, the engine held something close to 40% of the American heavy-duty market. Inside the company, that felt permanent. It was not. The V-Blot family arrived in 1957, extending Kettering's modular logic into a V configuration without abandoning the parts catalog. Same heads, same liners, same injectors. In 1970, the division merged with Allison Transmission to form Detroit Diesel Allison. This was peak institutional weight inside General Motors. From inside the building, the lead felt structural, it felt permanent. On the 6th of October, 1973, Egyptian and Syrian forces crossed into Israeli-held territory. Within days, the oil-producing nations imposed an embargo on the United States, and the American trucking industry recalculated everything overnight. Pump prices moved from around 38 cents a gallon toward a peak near 84. Fuel had been a secondary line on the spec sheet, a question you answered after horsepower, after torque, after reliability. Now it was the first question. Every renewal contract in the country opened with fuel economy and closed with fuel economy. For a national fleet running 1,500 trucks, a single mile per gallon was the difference between profit and loss across the entire operation. The arithmetic was not subtle. And the two-stroke, by the physics of its own architecture, was caught at a structural disadvantage. Because it fires every revolution, it depends on that mechanical blower to force fresh air into the cylinders continuously. The blower is a parasite. It steals horsepower straight off the crankshaft before the power ever reaches the transmission. At highway cruising speed, its thermal efficiency simply could not match a four-stroke. The fleet manager who had specified a Screaming Jimmy in 1972 for its power-to-weight was now sitting across from a controller who wanted to know why his fleet was spending 20% more on fuel than the company across town that bought Cummins. This is where the trap closed. At the precise moment the market changed for good, Detroit Diesel was building the most powerful heavy-duty diesel on sale in America. And power was suddenly not what anyone was buying. The company already had a new engine in development, the Series 92. A larger two-stroke, more displacement, more power, the architecture extended along its own logic. Years of engineering hours, tooling capital, and supplier commitments were already sunk into it. To walk away from the 92 in early 1974 meant writing off a major capital commitment on the basis of a crisis. The consensus still expected to be temporary. Fuel prices might stabilize. Customers had always wanted power. The two-stroke was what Detroit Diesel knew how to build at scale. On paper, in early 1974, the argument for staying the course was defensible. It was not a stupid argument. But inside Detroit Diesel's own engineering division, a different paper existed. The efficiency gap was documented. The parasitic load of the blower was measured. The incoming federal emission standards were modeled, and the modeling was not ambiguous. The two-stroke carried an inherent flaw for emissions, because the oil rings must constantly pass over open intake ports cut into the cylinder walls, and tiny amounts of engine oil are swept continuously into the exhaust. A sealed crankcase four-stroke would meet the Cummins standards far more cleanly and far more cheaply, and the engineering floor knew it. The position was stated plainly. A four-stroke program needs to begin now, alongside the 92, or this company will spend the next decade fighting the next market with the last decade's engine. In 1974, the Series 92 launched as planned. The four-stroke program was not funded. The gap between what the engineering floor wrote down and what the institution decided was now 13 years wide. Detroit Diesel's four-stroke replacement would not arrive until 1987. The competition did not wait for an invitation. Cummins, out of Columbus, Indiana, sent its salesmen into accounts that had run Screaming Jimmys for 20 years, and the numbers they carried were not horsepower. They were cost per mile. The language fleet managers actually spoke. Caterpillar ran the same play out of Peoria, Illinois. The four-stroke architecture both companies had been refining since before the embargo was now the only answer to the only question the market was asking. The migration was not a single dramatic event. It was a slow, accountable fleet-by-fleet erosion that nobody inside Detroit Diesel could point to as the moment the market was lost. A carrier orders 50 Cummins-powered tractors in 1976 to run alongside its Detroit fleet. The fuel logs come back 12 months later showing a clear improvement. The next cycle, that carrier orders 300 Cummins. The cycle after that, 900. Multiply that across every major carrier in the country, and you have the share figures that landed on a sales director's desk in the early 1980s. Through those years, General Motors poured tens of billions of dollars into modernizing the corporation, but the money flowed toward the passenger car divisions fighting Japanese imports. The heavy-duty diesel division was a captive internal supplier, fighting for crumbs. This is the true cost of that single 1974 decision. By choosing to double down on the two-stroke instead of pivoting early, Detroit Diesel wasted its years of corporate abundance. When the parent corporation's own crunch arrived, the four-stroke program required a level of investment. A captive division simply could no longer win. What that looked like from inside was a sequence of slower decisions, smaller engineering teams, longer development cycles, and tooling investments deferred a year at a time until the deferrals compounded into a generation of lost ground. Engineers who had joined the division because it was the best diesel program in America watched their best ideas wait for funding that never quite arrived. Some left. Some stayed because they were convinced the corporation would eventually see what it was losing. By 1988, the company's share of the American heavy-duty truck engine market had fallen to roughly 3 to 4%. A market share number is a clean way to hide what that actually meant on the ground. It meant fewer orders, which meant fewer shifts, which meant the man who had stood at the same inspection station for 30 years was not sure his line would be running next year. In a plant town, an engine division is not just an employer. It is the reason the diner stays open, the reason the union hall has the lights on, the reason a father can tell his son there is good work here if you want it. When the orders thin out, what erodes is not only a paycheck, it is a whole way a community understood itself. The men who had built the engine that carried the country were watching, year by year, the country decide it did not need what they made anymore. None of them did anything wrong. That is the part that stays with you. Here is what is genuinely hard about this period. The engineers who solved the scavenging problem in the 1930s, against the recommendation of their own committee, were exactly the kind of people who could have built the four-stroke replacement in 1975. The skill was on the floor. What was not there was the permission to start. The same corporation that gave Kettering one more attempt in the 30s could no longer hear its own engineers in the 70s. In 1987, 13 years late, Detroit Diesel finally launched the Series 60, a four-stroke, 12.7 liters. The first heavy-duty diesel sold in America with fully integrated electronic engine controls, mapping fuel in real time across the operating range. It was not designed as a power statement. It was designed as an efficiency statement, which was exactly what the market had been asking for since October of 1973. It was a genuinely good engine. It simply arrived more than a decade after the market needed it. And then one man outside the corporation did the arithmetic. Roger Penske is a name most people attach to motor racing, to the Indianapolis 500, and the team owner you saw on television on Memorial Day weekend. But the real expertise was operational. Penske ran a truck leasing business with tens of thousands of vehicles across North America. And he understood a diesel engine the way a fleet manager understands one, as a cost per mile figure across the life of a contract. When Penske looked at Detroit Diesel in 1987, he saw a company that had just launched a genuinely competitive engine that kept a deep engineering workforce. and that held a depressed market share with nowhere to go but up, provided it was run as a standalone business rather than as the neglected supplier of a corporation that had stopped funding it. The deal closed in 1988. Penske took 60% of Detroit Diesel. General Motors kept 40, and the moment the ownership changed, the conditions that had made the decline possible were gone. No parent corporation to lose budget arguments inside. No internal mission to subsidize. One product, the Series 60, and one job to sell it. Within a few years, as stricter federal emissions deadlines arrived in the early 1990s, on-highway two-stroke production was permanently phased out. The Screaming Jimmy, as the everyday sound of American commercial roads, fell silent. Two-stroke production continued for a while longer for marine, military, and stationary work. The engines that powered combat vehicles and fishing boats and generators that never got a refit budget. But on the interstates, in the truck stops where you used to hear it from a quarter mile off, the engine that defined 40 years of American freight was finished. The Penske turnaround was fast, and it was structural. All engineering resources went to the Series 60. The leasing fleet became a direct sales channel. Suppliers carried for years on the strength of the old corporate relationship were renegotiated against benchmark pricing. Market share climbed from that 3 to 4% floor in 1988 to around 33% by 1993. The company was commercially alive again. What it was no longer was everything Kettering had designed it to be. Mercedes-Benz took a stake in 1993. In the year 2000, the company was acquired outright and folded into Daimler's North American truck operation. The Detroit name survived. The engines in American trucks today still carry it. The company endured. The architecture did not. Stand at the old diesel site in Redford, Michigan today. Some of it is parking. Some of it is repurposed industrial space. The freight you can hear moving in the distance runs on engines built thousands of miles from where the Screaming Jimmy was born. Detroit Diesel built more than 5 million engines across its life, and for 50 years the two-stroke that descended from one stubborn prototype was the sound of the American road. That is what was being defended in 1974 when the institution chose the Series 92 over the four-stroke program. They were not defending an engine. They were defending the inheritance of 50 years of work. And the only way to actually preserve that inheritance was to walk away from it in time. The institution could not see that. The men on the floor could. The company did not die. What died was the decision inside the institution that owned it to keep fighting for the engine its own engineering floor had built. We did not lose Detroit Diesel. We lost what Detroit Diesel chose to stop being. If you ever drove behind a Screaming Jimmy, or worked on one, or grew up listening to your father talk about the engine that built his working life, I want to hear about it. Which engine, which truck, which job? Tell me in the comments. The men and women who built more than 5 million of these engines deserve to be remembered properly, by name, by shift, by the city they did it in. We are building the largest archive of American industrial history on this channel, and every story you leave becomes part of the record. If this one was worth your time, a like helps the next person who needs to hear it find it, and a subscribe keeps you with us for the next one. I will see you there.